Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Mac Stadium, Hover, and Tower. I'm John Voorhees, and with me as always is Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know, we're recording this on Friday before it comes out on Monday, and it just so happened that right before you and I started up, there was a big announcement of a bunch of rule changes by Apple for the app review guidelines. And so we scrapped what we were going to talk about, which was ironically enough going to be about the App Store. And we'll get back to that at another time. But we thought we would talk a little bit about these rules because there's a lot of rules covering a lot of different things. But the primary focus, I think, is on some of the controversies that have recently surrounded Apple regarding game streaming and other aspects of game apps, partly related to the Fortnite dispute, but also partly related to things like Google Stadia and Microsoft xCloud and those sorts of services.
Right.
Where should we start, do you think? Do you want to just start digging right with the gaming rules?
Sure. And I mean, you used to be a lawyer, John, so you went through these updated guidelines with your lawyer eye.
I did. They gave me flashbacks.
Yeah, and I'm very thankful that every once in a while we run into this kind of coverage that requires a lawyer's expertise. And of course, you always come in handy for that kind of stuff. But basically, so here's what we know. Apple has said, and I know that this is going to sound controversial, and we're going to try and dissect all the changes here and all the, reading between the lines of these announcements.
Right.
So Apple said that they will allow game streaming services and streaming games on the App Store. So this means that a game streaming service, again, Apple didn't name specifically, different companies, but
Sure.
You can imagine Google Stadia, xCloud. There's some other game streaming services out there these days. There's one from Epic, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. There's one from PlayStation, for example. They will be able to offer catalog apps on the App Store. So imagine you download, again, an example, the Google Stadia app from the App Store, and it's a catalog that shows you all the games that are available on Google Stadia. So far, so good. Here's the catch. Apple says that even though they will allow streaming in the sense of the developer can choose to use, local play, or some parts of the game are local, other parts of the game are streamed, or it's an entirely streaming affair, like the delivery mechanism doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
What matters to Apple is that every single game, right, from these services has to offer its own downloadable binary on the App Store. So it's a little counterintuitive in that they will allow game streaming services. However, each game still needs to be downloaded from the App Store.
Right, it has to be a separate app. We're not talking about an app for the game streaming service itself. We're talking about the games delivered by the streaming service.
The games
has to have a separate app for every single game.
Yes. So every single game from those services needs to have its own separate listing on the App Store.
Right.
You need to be able to go to the App Store and find that game. And according to Apple, this isn't necessary for a bunch of reasons. First of all, each game still needs to be reviewed by Apple. So it's not like Google says, okay, we want to offer Stadia on the App Store. Here's Stadia, there's a portal, and the user can click on the game and the game launches. No. Each game needs to be submitted to Apple as its own separate thing. This is necessary in addition to app review because Apple wants each game to have its own product page with metadata that the user can find via search, that supports reviews and ratings, and that also integrates, of course, with parental controls and screen time. Now, the big counterintuitive thing here is that the whole point of services like xCloud, like Stadia, is that you install, you run, the main program, like the main application, the main portal, and then you click on something and you start playing right away. Correct? Like you click on a game.
You don't have to download the game, which is...
You don't have to download anything. You just click and it streams and you play via a powerful console or a powerful PC, streaming it, right, over the internet.
Right.
Now, Apple says, well, you can do that, but after the fact. And at the very first step is always to be that each game needs to be downloaded by the user. Now, there appears to be some confusion here regarding the the content of the separate game on the App Store.
Right. How much of a shell can it be, right? I mean, does it have to actually be a playable game with some level of content, or can it be merely a wrapper for a streaming service for that particular game? Does that describe it right, do you think?
Yeah, I think it describes it right. And I think based on my understanding, Apple seems to be okay with the kind of purely local or purely streaming nature. Like developers can choose to let you download a game from the App Store, and all you see is a menu and like the launch page, and then it says you gotta stream the rest of the game. And my understanding from the guidelines and from what Apple said, this should be okay. Like even if you literally download something and all it says is you're gonna need an internet connection to play the rest of the game, and the rest of the game is streamed from somebody's servers, I think that should be okay. It's not specifically written out as such in the guidelines, hence the confusion, but
Right.
It should be okay. However, Apple is still, no matter how you slice it, I think what really matters here is that Apple is still adding an extra step, right, to these game streaming services. They're still saying,
Right.
look, it's fine, we're going to approve you. However, it's not like you click on a game and it opens and it starts streaming. There still needs to be an extra step in that the user needs to go to the App Store and click Get, right, to get the game on their device.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Mac Stadium. Mac Stadium is the leading provider of Apple Mac infrastructure as a service. Whether you need a single Mac Mini or a fully scalable Mac private cloud, Mac Stadium can help you move your iOS and Mac app development out from under your desk and into the cloud. Mac Stadium is the only provider of enterprise-class Apple Mac infrastructure as a service. Think AWS or Azure, but built on Mac hardware. Mac Stadium has years of expertise doing this with companies like Capital One, Dropbox, Shopify, Pandora, and a whole lot more. And they support many of your favorite development tools like Homebrew and Node.js. You can start with a single Mac Mini if you're a small team or just need a hosted Mini for your personal use. However, they can also provide scalable private clouds that can go from one Mac to thousands with dedicated firewalls, super fast storage, and a global footprint in data centers all over the world. And with Mac Stadium, you get private dedicated hardware and the same level of security you would get with something like AWS or Azure. In other words, they've got a long list of security certifications. Want to move your iOS or Mac development to the cloud? Talk to Mac Stadium. Learn more about Mac Stadium's infrastructure at macstadium.com/appstories. And for listeners of this show, Mac Stadium is offering 2 months for the price of one on a Mac Mini subscription. Just enter the promo code AppStories at checkout. Again, that URL to learn more about Mac Stadium's infrastructure is macstadium.com/appstories. And if you want to get 2 months of a mini subscription for the price of one, use that promo code AppStories so they know you came from the show. Our thanks to Mac Stadium for their support of the show. People are getting really wound around the technical issue of what exactly the binary looks like that has to be downloaded.
Right.
But there are also a lot of practical aspects of this too, which is instead of just providing a single app that allows you to stream games, the providers of these services have to then wrangle all these games from all these different publishers and developers, have some sort of downloadable game, whatever that might be, have all the App Store submissions with all the metadata, and go through that entire process in addition to having whatever that game looks like. So there's a practical speed bump here to offering games this way.
Right. And there sure is, there's some confusion today as we're recording this. It's very likely that over the weekend, after we record this episode, there will be some official statements from Microsoft and Google. At the moment, there are no such statements from those companies. So I think the way I look at this is there's a real-time follow-up, I guess. This is lucky because we're doing the show now. Google is not commenting on these changes at the moment. So no comment from Google on Stadia coming to iOS.
All
so
right.
at least we know that. I guess my big problem, to go back to what I was saying, is why make a difference for games and not apply the same rule to streaming video and streaming movies, for example? So why? Because if we follow the same reasoning, right, a company like Netflix should be forced to offer every single TV show, every single movie as a binary on the App Store. But that's not the case, right? You go to Netflix and you click on something and it starts streaming.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting too, because in a way, these rules, I think they make that weird distinction even stranger, because you could have argued a week ago that the reason was because games are executable apps, and executable apps can do things to your device, right? I mean, they could pull data off of it. They could do other things. They could create other mischief with the system, where a video file is less likely, not impossible, but less likely to be able to do that. But now, the fact that these games can still be streamed, the fact that they have to be downloaded but they can still be streamed, kind of argues in favor of the idea that a movie, a song, whatever it is, should be treated exactly like a game.
Yeah, I really struggle to understand this, and to an extent, I still feel like, even though these guidelines are welcome, the fact that Apple is saying we will allow game streaming services,
right,
and of course, as you might imagine, if they want to offer purchase options, they will have to use in-app purchases, which is another topic in and of itself, right? Because you can imagine that all games with microtransactions will have to switch to in-app purchases instead, which
right.
I don't know how many companies want to do, because if it's up to the individual publisher, as it works right now on consoles, the individual publisher can, put up a screen in line within the game that says, hey, if you want to buy this piece of clothing or this special weapon, it's a microtransaction. And this purchase goes through our system. It doesn't go through Sony or Microsoft or Google. It goes through our own store. That's not possible if they want to bring that game to iOS and participate in one of these game streaming services. Those microtransactions will be affected as well, because they will have to use in-app purchases. So, but the bigger problem is, I fear that Apple is still, to an extent, not getting the gaming industry. I will be really surprised if Google and Microsoft are going to be totally on board with this.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what you're pointing out, especially with the microtransactions, is that the more you think about this and how it interfaces with the existing gaming industry, you realize that it's just very complex for anyone to try to comply with this, because it just doesn't really fit the model that exists for those streaming services. And as a result, it's going to cost money and time for someone to do it, if they even want to do it. And they're much less likely to want to do it if it's going to cost them. And so I suspect that this won't change a lot in terms of services coming to iOS. I really think this really kind of shuts the door to those kinds of services, at least the Stadia type services. I mean, there are other services, and you can see in these rules the carve outs for things like Game Club, because Game Club is a bunch of old iOS games that have been revitalized that were no longer compatible with current versions of iOS. They've been brought back. And some of these rules kind of work around exactly how that works, because Game Club has a catalog app. Game Club has a subscription service, but Game Club also allows people who originally owned those games before they were taken off the App Store to re-download them for free and use them, even if they don't subscribe to Game Club. So you can see in here things like you can have a subscription to a service that's for games, but you cannot disadvantage non-subscribers. So you can see things where these kinds of rules probably already existed around the time Game Club came out, more than a year ago now, but now they've been codified into an actual rule. And I mean, there is a benefit to having these rules. People at least know the rules by which they're playing. You don't have to like them, though. And I think, the reality of the situation is that this isn't going to make having streaming services for games any more likely on iOS.
Yeah. And like I said, As somebody who plays video games a lot myself, I still do not think this is an ideal solution. I don't think Apple is making the right call here in adding all these extra steps. And my main problem is, like, I get it. Apple wants to have control. Apple wants to apply its app review process. Apple wants to get a cut of those microtransactions with in-app purchases. I understand it.
Right.
However, there's also a bigger theme at play, which is game streaming services are the future, and they're not going away. And we're seeing today how the major video game companies and the console makers, they are at this very moment preparing the launches of two consoles. One of them, especially the Xbox, that will rely heavily on streaming and a subscription service for games with Game Pass, right, on Xbox. This is the future. This is not going away. This is happening now because the technology is ready and, people are moving away from physical purchases of video games. It's happening. And I fear that Apple may be left behind if they don't cave just a little bit more to this reality, right?
It's a shame. It's a shame too, Federico, because they've got the technology to do it. That's the thing. I mean, we've had an Apple TV sitting under our TVs for quite a while that, the rumors are it's going to get updated. And these ARM processors are capable, I think, of doing streaming. You've got even, it's interesting to me because what I think this means is things like arcade are going to be relegated to the kinds of games that we've seen so far, which there are good games in there, but they're going to be indie games. They're going to be simpler puzzle games. They're not going to be the console AAA type of titles. Now, we haven't seen that, but there's no reason why Apple shouldn't try to attract those. Nintendo certainly does with hardware that's far inferior to an Xbox or a PlayStation, but they get the AAA games because they know how the industry works, and they play by those rules. And maybe Apple's content not to do that. I've always felt there's an interview that was done with Eddie Q years ago that I wrote about when we did the 10th anniversary of the App Store, and I covered the history of iOS gaming, where it was pretty clear to me that Apple kind of fell into gaming and the success with all the in-app purchases and everything, and that they've been pretty content for a lot of years just getting by on casual gaming because it's very lucrative. But there's a lot more to gaming than casual games, and I think Apple's got the hardware to support it. Only if they understood it and maybe had the will to do it, maybe we might have a better gaming experience on our Apple devices. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Hover, a service I've been using for years. When you have one big idea, where do you go? For a ton of entrepreneurs, Hover is that big leap because your business starts with a domain name. Hover has over 300 domain name extensions to choose from. No matter what you want to build, there's a domain name waiting for it. And they have excellent technical support to answer any questions you might have. And on top of that, they're dedicated to getting you online and not upselling you. Hover has free who-is privacy, so the bad guys don't know your information, a clean UX and UI, monthly sales on popular top-level domains, and it's easy to see why Hover is the popular choice for people starting businesses. All of my domains are with Hover. I've been using them since, I think, around 2013 when I started my company and I had an app idea. One of the first things I did was come up with a name and then go buy the domain. And since then, I've bought other domains there as well, including for my kids, so that they have domains, which are their names. It's both affordable and easy to set up, and if your domains are somewhere else, it's easy to move them to Hover too. We know you like intuitive user experiences and things that just work right out of the box, so I know you'll absolutely appreciate Hover. Their UX and UI is really simple, clean, and easy to navigate. Buy your domain and start using it today. Go to hover.com/appstories and get 10% off all new purchases. That URL, one more time, is hover.com/appstories. Make sure you use it so you get that 10% off on new purchases. Make a name for yourself with Hover. Our thanks to Hover for their support of the show.
At a higher level, the big conceptual issue for me is that I don't understand at this point, what's the difference between streaming content off of Netflix and streaming games off of something like xCloud and Stadia? Like, it's still entertainment. Whether you're watching a movie or a TV show or playing a video game, it's entertainment, right? It's a story. It's something that you do to relax. It's basically the same kind of activity. I don't understand why there has to be different rules in place for gaming. And I guess the answer is because the economics of that are different, and Apple wants to control all those microtransactions or those in-app purchases because they constitute they are one major source of revenue for the App Store. Otherwise, I really cannot come up with any other explanation.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there are already lines drawn that don't make a lot of sense. The difference between a physical book and an electronic book is kind of arbitrary too. It's just that this is even worse because it's two different kinds of digital goods, which is really hard to, draw a line between, I think.
Yeah, so this is basically what's happening right now with game streaming services. Like I said, I'm not sure that Google and Microsoft will like this approach. The idea of, because it gets so complex, right? To go, like, imagine Google and Microsoft, they need to go to each of those publishers of those games and say, well, if you want to launch Stadia or xCloud on iOS, then you need to go in and submit your game to the App Store,
right.
And and using purchases instead of your own custom microtransactions. It gets very complex very fast.
Well, and what happens once a game gets rejected and somehow one Stadia game or two Stadia games aren't available on iOS, but they're available everywhere else?
We don't know,
right? I mean, that becomes really strange. Or I think there's another issue of what if a game is available on two different streaming services.
Right.
Do they have to have two different versions for each streaming service on the iPhone?
Right. And Apple did not clarify that aspect of what happens is something like Grand Theft Auto, for example, is available both on Sony and Microsoft, the other streaming services. Can it be the same binary on the App Store, or does it have to be two separate versions like GTA PlayStation and GTA Xbox? That's not clear at the moment. So I'm not sure this is a workable scenario, honestly. I appreciate the fact that Apple is saying we allow game streaming services, but how do you allow them? That's the problem.
Right. I think that would be really confusing to users to have two different versions of GTA on there. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a good solution at all. There's another clarifying. There's the rules that came out. There was a list of new rules, but also a list of clarifications. And one of them, I think the other one that's related to games, that's specifically related to Epic that we should mention, is that there's a clarification that games should not have hidden functionality that users can't find or app review can't find, which is pretty clearly, I think, in my opinion, related to Epic, sneaking in that in-app purchase behavior in Fortnite, whatever it was, 3 or 4 weeks ago.
All right, so there's a bunch of other changes, as we mentioned, in the updated guidelines, and we want to go through some of these highlights. One of them, I think, everybody's talking about game streaming services, but this one should also be considered. Guideline 3.1.3a, it says the reader apps. So it's something we talked about before, the idea of a reader app. So something that gives you access to magazines or, video streaming or comic books, that kind of stuff, may offer account creation for free. So you can now create an account for those services if it's a free account inside their iOS and iPadOS client, and they can also offer account management functionality for existing users. So this means that something like Kindle, for example, which is considered a reader app,
right,
it cannot offer other purchase methods, right? And it cannot embed call to action to purchase content outside of the iOS app, meaning Amazon still cannot put up a link in the Kindle app that says go to Amazon.com to purchase your books. They cannot do that. However, they can let you create a free account now. So that's maybe not a huge change, but it's something.
Yeah, I wondered, though, do you know if that means that they can also offer free content? Because I know, for instance, that the Kindle...
Apple says free tiers, so whatever that means.
Yeah, well, tiers, I would think, would just mean like tiers of a subscription, not necessarily actual content. Which, to me, it's interesting because, like, the Kindle there are free books on the Kindle, and I wonder whether they can list those but not other things. I'm not sure they would want to do that. I think account management is interesting, though. I mean, suppose you subscribe to Comixology and you created that subscription on the web, you'd be able to go into the app and cancel your subscription, for instance. But That doesn't mean that you'd be able to buy one-off comic books inside there. I know for Comixology is another good example because they offer both kind of an all-you-can-eat comic book experience as well as one-off books that you can buy, and you could go in there and manage that subscription, but you wouldn't be able to actually buy individual issues.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And also related to this, Apple also said that apps for paid online services, so the standalone companion apps to a paid web-based tool, and Apple mentions voice over IP apps, cloud storage, email services. Of course, they're talking about Hey. They do not need to use in-app purchases. So that was mentioned a few weeks ago with the whole Hey saga. Now it's codified in the guidelines. But, however, as you may expect, there cannot be any purchasing inside of those apps, and there cannot be any calls to action for purchase outside of the app. So they're saying, if you're Hey, if you are, what's it called? Google OneDrive. It's called Google One or something. I don't know.
OneDrive is Microsoft.
OneDrive is Microsoft.
I think it's just Google Drive. Yeah.
Google Drive. Yeah. So if you're Skype, right, for one of these companies, you're not forced to offer in-app purchases, which was one of the contentious points from the Hey debacle a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
However, you cannot embed your own payment methods either. So you can just essentially, people need to know that they need to pay you via the web elsewhere, and then they can download the iOS app and they can log in, but there can be no purchasing involved.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that is pretty consistent with what we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Tower. If you're a developer or a designer, you're probably using Git. The question is, are you getting the most out of it? If you find yourself constantly Googling Git commands and not using Git's most advanced features because you're worried things might break, then today's sponsorship can help. Tower offers a better way to use Git. Imagine if you could undo mistakes in Git with a simple keyboard shortcut like Command-Z. That's amazing. Or deal with pull requests directly on your desktop. And use interactive rebase or cherry pick a commit simply with drag and drop. Or clone a repository from GitHub with a single click. Tower lets you do exactly that and so much more. You can finally take advantage of Git's powerful feature set in a beautiful interface that will make you more productive every single day. Better yet, Tower is a native app. It's not Electron or any of those other cross-platform solutions. It's not just a Git client. It's a better way to work with Git. We use Git at Mac Stories for all of our writing. We're not developers, but we use it because it's a great versioning system that we can use for collaborating on documents. And when things get a little hairy and start looking like I may need to roll back commits or I've got conflicts, I've turned to Tower because Tower has all the features that you need to do things like that and a whole lot more complex than that with an amazing interface that makes it intuitive and easy to use. And if you're a developer, you absolutely should use Tower because you want to spend time working on your code, not messing around with Git. Tower lets you do exactly that. More than 100,000 developers and designers use Tower to be more productive with Git. From Git beginners to Git experts, from indie developers to startups, all the way to Fortune 500 companies. Go to get-tower.com and download a 30-day free trial. And with the coupon App Stories at checkout, new users will get 30% off. Again, that URL is get-tower.com and the code AppStories for 30% off. Our thanks to Tower for their support of the show. You know, another thing that we should mention is there are new rules around advertising. And I thought this was an interesting rule just because there are two pieces to it. It appears in two different places. The first one is a little broader than advertising. It says that app clips, widgets, extensions, and notifications should be related to the content and functionality of your app. You know, it makes total sense. And you can see where this is kind of heading because it says, additionally, all app clip features and functionality must be included in the main app binary. App clips cannot contain advertising. So I'm sure that this is in the initial app review of some app clip functionality that developers are trying to find a way to use app clips as an advertising mechanism. So that has been precluded here. Further down, there's another provision that says display advertising should be limited to your main app executable and should not be included in extensions, app clips, widgets, notifications, keyboards, watchOS apps, etc. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, boy, I've never seen an ad in a keyboard, and I sure hope I don't ever. But have you ever?
My God!
Have you ever? Notifications, of course, is interesting because I think there's an awful lot of notifications that push that boundary that are promotional in nature, though maybe not an advertisement to purchase something, but that, that I think that's the area where this gets pushed the most that I see it. App clips obviously aren't out yet, and we've only seen a couple of them, and they don't involve, the ones we've seen don't have advertising, nor do widgets. But boy, I certainly wouldn't want to see an ad pop up on my keyboard or even on a watchOS app. I haven't personally run into that in all the apps that we've reviewed, but I'm glad that is there. We'll have to see where the boundaries get pushed there, I suppose.
Yeah, don't you know? I only use keyboards with ads in them. That's my favorite way to write, John.
Federico. That's what the special row. That's what the special row that hides the tab bar is for. It's to send you special offers.
I love to hit my favorite letters and then just look at an ad as I do that. It's amazing.
And then whenever you hit the space bar, you buy something. A hamburger is delivered to your apartment.
Don't give shady developers some awful ideas, please. Okay. Is there anything else worth noting here? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, right? For example, if you're an application that offers virtual classes, you can now use different purchase methods for one-to-one classes, but not one-to-few or one-to-many.
Right.
This was also there was a story a while back about Apple profiting from virtual classes applications during the pandemic. So I guess this is a response to that, maybe.
Yeah, I think it was the kind of thing where there were people who were doing things like booking yoga classes through their app, and then during the pandemic they kind of pivoted to not only booking them but also people taking the classes. And so I think this is meant to clarify that. And then there's another rule about personal loans, and this to me, boy, this is another flashback to being a lawyer, but I'm not surprised that this exists. Payday loans have infiltrated the App Store. Apparently, I have not run into this, but if you are using your app to make a loan to somebody, you have to disclose the basic terms of it. Just the same kind of things that are in a lot of disclosure laws, at least in the United States, on a state or federal level, for disclosing the terms of loans. They have some very specific examples of interest rates and other types of things that have to be disclosed. So, if you make that kind of app, you're going to be subject to that. It's probably something, if you're making loans, you're probably subject to that anyway outside of the App Store, but the App Store is adopting that sort of thing to protect consumers too. All right, Federico, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. As Federico mentioned, we have just gotten this news. It's Friday afternoon, and it could develop between now and the time we actually get this episode out on Monday, because other than Google having no comment, there has been no follow-up from any other companies that might be affected by this. But I'm sure we will continue to hear about it, and it's clear that many in the gaming community are not happy about these rules. We have already heard from many of them, especially I think Federico has gotten a lot of love from people who are gamers.
You should look at my replies. I should probably enable the quality filter today. People are really upset.
It's probably
it's bad when they start tagging at Tim Cook and at Phil Schiller. I mean, the guy is not even in charge of marketing anymore.
Right.
I mean, I guess he's overseeing the App Store though. So,
but you're in charge, Federico. That's why they're bringing the complaints direct to your doorstep.
I am responsible.
Absolutely. And you didn't even write the article. I did. All right, Federico. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for today. We're going to be back next week with our fourth and final interview of our summer preview series. So stay tuned for that. It's been a fun summer. We've talked to a lot of developers. We've got another design episode coming. I'm not going to reveal who it is yet, but stay tuned for that episode. I also want to thank our 3 sponsors for this week. That's Mac Stadium, Hover, and Tower. Of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net writing. We've got an Apple event coming up very soon, so we'll have lots of coverage of that. Federico is also on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.